The US military has just been ordered to prepare for the worst case scenario in the Middle East. Now, in this video, we are going to dig into what is the worst case scenario, what is to be expected, and what is actually happening in the Middle East. Because you have reports like China is now in the Middle East and is ready to attack the United States. You also have news stories of Delta Force inside of Gaza looking for hostages. Okay, the Middle East right now has literally two separate battles: the information war and what is actually happening war. First things first, the White House, yes, has given an order for the US military to prepare for a worst case scenario. However, the US military, like every big military in the world, has scenarios already planned out. This is a common practice, especially when you get to the higher echelons of the Pentagon, who are in charge of certain areas of the world, like the Pacific and Africa, the Middle East. Now, what is a worst case scenario? All of our minds go to World War III. That must be the worst case scenario. But to the White House, the mission is very specific. Be prepared to evacuate hundreds of thousands of Americans out of the Middle East, and for the US military to be prepared for attacks on multiple fronts in multiple countries. So again, I'm trying to put things into context for you so everyone is not freaking out of, oh my gosh, the White House is telling the US military prepare for World War III. The White House wants the Pentagon to be prepared for everything. Do you think the nuke subs traveling around the world are not prepared with battle plans already? Please, again, be very careful with your sources and try to think about things in context. And speaking of context, why all of a sudden do we have this worldwide warning for US civilians and for US naval assets, for all things United States? The longer Israel prolongs this war and the longer the US military and the United States stands with Israel, this is what's going to happen. I mean, people, we can go all over social media and it's a post about your favorite type of bacon and it's hashtag Free Palestine. That is just the landscape right now in the entire world and on the internet especially. Now let's talk about the specific scenarios where the US military is starting to realize things are not looking good. Let's start with Iraq. Iraq has had multiple bases that have been attacked by an unidentified military group. We'll get to them in a second. You have bases in Syria who are also receiving an uptick in attacks. Now the news story is not so much that bases are being attacked. Like obviously the US military knows they have enemies in the Middle East, so eventually they're probably going to get attacked. The real story is this: the Islamic resistance in Iraq. I tried to cross-reference this specific group to the CIA database, and I know that sounds like, oh, I'm so cool. This is a public database. Anyone can go to CIA.gov. You can even look for a job, but you can also go to their database and look at every single bad guy group in the world, and they specify where they are from and what their objectives are. The Islamic resistance in Iraq is not on the list, nor can you really find them anywhere on the internet. However, they are putting out public information saying we are the ones responsible for attacking US assets. Now, to make things even more confusing, the Islamic resistance in Iraq is responsible for attacking bases in Syria. So if we put two and two together, yes, they are called the Islamic resistance in Iraq. However, the speculation is, and from a lot of sources I'm seeing, is that it is a coalition of groups coming together. Now, I've talked about this group before in my other YouTube channels, but again, they are a relatively new force. From the time I'm making this video, they've only made public statements in the last week. And taking claim up in Syria, taking claim all over Iraq, obviously this is either a really big group or a bunch of groups who have come together. I want to give a little credit to the intelligence agencies in the United States. They're actually pretty good at identifying specific groups all over the world. Again, if you go to the public databases, they get extremely specific. And for this group to not be around, and we've been in the Middle East for an extremely long time, and Israel doesn't even know who they are, again, a very profound intelligence agency, it's quite concerning that all of a sudden you have this new coalition. Now, another example as to why the US military is prepared for an all-out evacuation in the Middle East is because what's happening in Lebanon. There's been a lot of fake reports going on in Lebanon that the US embassy has caught on fire like we're the French embassy in Niger, Africa. That's not quite the case. However, there have been a lot of protests, near riots, and a lot of escalation of protests towards US assets in Lebanon. And what's also happening in Lebanon, you have Hezbollah to the south causing a lot of damage to Israel. And so you don't want US citizens to be at the mercy of Hezbollah in Lebanon, because guess what? In their opening statements of existence, they went in on the US, but they also went in on the French and Israel. They do not like the US. If you are now just figuring out US citizens and US military assets are not liked in the Middle East, you need to start paying attention. Again, this is why Washington is giving the order to the Pentagon to create the scenarios or to be prepared for the worst case scenario. Now, I have to point this out because when I say evacuation in the Middle East, I know some of you history nerds are going straight to what happened in Afghanistan. Now, although I say this in a joking matter, I also say this in a very serious matter. We evacuated Afghanistan, yes, but we also learned a lot from that evacuation. The amount of people we were able to evacuate out of Afghanistan is actually staggering with minimal casualties, which, by the way, we should have never had casualties. That's a whole nother video for another time, but more and more evidence and stories is coming out as to what actually happened at Kabul airport. The US military is actually really good at learning from their mistakes and learning from their failures and starting to apply it to their modern combat operations. Now, for those of you who are not aware and you've never served in the US military, I was in the Army, and as a combat engineer, I would often ask, where did we learn how to do these tactics? Where did this all come from? Quite literally, the engineers from Vietnam, and quite literally, the engineers from World War II. If there's ever a country who has an entire tunnel system and the United States is up against them in a war, who do you think we can go to for references on how to defeat tunnels? The tunnel rats of Vietnam. So again, although in Afghanistan we had quite an embarrassing story and we evacuated all of these civilians, in case we have to do that again, we have a reference point on how to do it. Now again, don't take this as, oh, the American is coming up with excuses. Just keep that in mind. That's how the US military has always operated. Although it looks like the biggest failure here, it might actually work in our favor in case there are more evacuations. Now, beyond the Middle East and the land territories, there's also a warning for any ships who are in the Red Sea. We know that the Houthis managed to launch off a ton of rockets and a ton of drones from Yemen towards Israel. US Navy stepped in and actually took them out, and apparently they had a lobster and steak dinner that night. Well, now the warning has actually gone out to all maritime units, so your regular civilian ships, cruise liners, and your military ships. The warning is be prepared and be careful in the Red Sea for any sort of attacks. Because look, the Houthis and other factions, these are not some cave dwellers. They watch the news, they watch the media, and they would love to take out a US asset who took out one of their assets. Now, as far as Washington telling the Pentagon to prepare for scenarios, another real scenario is this. The Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has actually given a real order to start preparing units for deployments. Now, there are units in the US military who are already on a ready status. They can deploy at a moment's notice. But this was an implication of getting more units prepared to deploy. And so because of this, we have the unfortunate situation where the US military is starting to get sucked back into the Middle East at a whole new level. Because again, we are already in the Middle East, even though the Iraq war ended. As soon as we pulled out, it got worse, so we had to go back in. We're definitely not in Afghanistan, but we are highly active in Syria. Now, this is just speculation, and I'm reading a lot of military blogs and some professionals in the space. The speculation is this: these military units are trying to drag the US military back into the Middle East, and because of this will start to piss off US citizens, and then you have disarray within the United States. Again, total speculation. You can leave your comment as to why the US military wants to deploy more units into the Middle East. But again, this is all speculation. I try to stick to the facts here. Okay, so these are the things to look out for. The Islamic resistance in Iraq. They are the wild card that no one is talking about, and if you are watching this video, again, be prepared for this unit and group to keep popping up. Something else to look out for is the force posture in Syria is getting very serious. As more and more bases are getting attacked in Syria, the US military needs to figure out who are doing these attacks and how we can start to strike back. Because Syria is already a power vacuum between the Russians, the government. A lot of factions are in that group, and a lot of factions can cause confusion for the US military. Something else to look out for is how serious are these proxy units in actually attacking Israel, or do they really just want to attack the US military? The US military has put themselves in a position where they can't turn back now. They've already stated that they're going to stand with Israel, but because of this, they are starting to see the consequences of standing with Israel. Not saying this in a bad way, not saying this in a good way. Nonetheless, there has been an uptick in attacks ever since we made the statement of we stand with Israel as soon as the war started.